Hello, it's round 1 of candidates, and I'm checking out the game between Fabiano Caruana and Hikaru Nakamura. By the rules of the candidates, compatriots have to meet in the first round, so there's no helping out each other in the last round or anything like that. So we have this clash early on, and we have the Berlin, which is the choice of Nakamura. And recently he played this against Etienne Bacro, I think, in the Grand Prix, and he made a very comfortable draw because Etienne just castled here and went into the main line of the Berlin. He castled, I think knight e4 was played, rook e1, knight d6, and we had this symmetrical position after knight e5, and let's not bother it too much. Also, I think that Nakamura is very good, very well prepared in the endgame as well, so Caruana just tried to keep it not so forced, and he played d3. And after bishop c5 by Naka, bishop takes c6, dc. And I think this is the structure that Fabiano really likes, because this is like Rossolimo, but with the colors reversed. And in the match against Magnus, he had had a couple of very nice positions in the Rossolimo, so I think he's not unhappy to play this type of structure. He continues with knight bd2. He doesn't want to get to c3 because he wants to put his knight to make some use of this knight on the queen side. He wants to do knight b3, knight a5 to restrict the bishop on c8. But first, black goes bishop e6, castles, bishop d6, and now knight b3. Now this knight heads for a5, trying to hit b7 and to slightly annoy black in this position. And black still waits with the castle. He might go for a long castle, he might just stay in the center for a while. And he plays queen e7 first. Also, the e5 pawn is a bit problematic at the moment, because you would like perfectly to play f7, f6 and to defend the pawn on e5, but this knight on f6 makes it a bit tougher. So maybe one move is to play knight d7, but probably knight g5 is a bit annoying because it chops the bishop off the board, and there's no bishop pair anymore for black, and that was basically his only advantage in the position, since he has double pawns. So also, instead of queen e7, a5 is very interesting, and there was one game on top level which went like this: queen e1, a4, knight a5, and queen b8 to defend this pawn. And now queen a7 is a big threat, forcing knight c4 and potentially some exchange on c4. So b4 here is very good. And the game continued, and black made some inaccuracies in the end. I mean, in a few moves, just to show you. Bishop g4, knight h4, castles, knight c4. And here black played bishop e6, which allowed this, and f4. And with the king side being opened and also opposite color bishops, it's not easy to defend this position. Especially if you allow knight f5 at some point, or just this feels a bit uncomfortable for black. After this, bishop f4, d6 also feels pressured, and it's not very naive. But anyways, let's go back to the game. in the game, queen e7 happened, knight a5, and now rook b8. So black now decides not to castle on the queen side at all. Probably it's a correct decision, because if you castle, you just invite some attack, some very, very strange attack with a3, b4, and slowly opening up the queen side. I don't like this for black, so rook b8 was fine. And now Fabiano plays bishop g5, trying to provoke some pawn moves on the king side. That's what Nakamura does. And now bishop h4. Now he's asking for more. Give me g5, give me g5. And Nakamura gives him g5. Bishop g3, and now knight d7. And now the king side pawn structure is a bit compromised in case black castles on the king side. So the ideal thing to do here is to just keep your king in the center and to try something like f6, h5, and try to get some play on the king side. But the bad thing about this position is that his rooks are not connected, and it's bad for the attack, for some potential attack. If the rooks are not connected, you cannot bring all the forces in. And after knight d7, h5 was slightly annoying here. For example, if white plays something slow like knight d2, maybe to get his knight to c4, let's say, then black has h5 and white has to make some pawn moves here to free his bishop. Let's say f3, but after bishop c5, let's say king h1, h4, bishop e1, knight f6. This idea looks a bit annoying, and this is a very good position for black, I would say. So when somebody strikes on the flank, you strike in the center. And that's what Fabiano does. He plays d4, trying to challenge this always soft pawn on e5. And now Nakamura plays f6. Queen d3. A very nice waiting move, which also reinforces the c4 square for the knight. And also you want to go rook a d1 and double anyways. So it's a good move. And now h5. A very logical move by black. Just trying to expand on the king side. Castling just doesn't work here. I think it doesn't work because it would lead to some very passive position for black. After this, let's say rook f d8, rook a d1, knight b6, take it, let's say cd, and after b3, I don't think that this pawn push has any benefits for black. Because whichever pawn you push, you make some weakness further on. And it's not principle to play g5 and f6 and then castle. So, long story short, it doesn't feel good. So he plays h5, which is quite normal. And now Fabi took on e5, knight e5, bishop takes e5, fe, and now he went to c4. Trying to hit on e5. And that's why Hikaru plays rook d8, trying to pin the queen. Although here it was an interesting moment, and the opportunity for black to go bishop c4, queen c4, and just king d7 to make some kind of artificial castle. Put the rook on f8 or g8, king on c8, and that way to try to make some play on the king side. He plays this. Fabi took on d6, cd, and now queen e3. Now I think g4 was completely natural. Rook g8 doesn't feel good because this rook belongs on h8, and I think that the other rook should go to g8 or f8, and this one should stay on h8. So g4 is just a move that would anyways be played, so why not play it now? Knight d2, and now it's time to defend the pawn by a6. And also, yeah, there's a small issue with the pawn on a7, that's why b3. And here, I would say very strange move by Nakamura. I don't know, it felt a bit weird. He castled here, with g4 h5 being played already. I don't really like that move. He lost all his dynamics on the king side, and now white is gonna take over the initiative. For example, here, some move like king d7 or first h4 with king d7 seemed quite nice. With the same idea, to make some artificial castle on the queen side and to put the rooks on the g and h files and try to generate some play. But he plays castles, and now Fabi uses the opportunity to open up the king side by f3. And now the queen has to defend. Because now moves like queen h6 were quite annoying after f3. And queen on g7 covers nicely h6. And now it's very tough to suggest any good move, because in the end it's all gonna come up to the d6 pawn, which is gonna be very weak, and also this majority might decide 2 against 1 in some deep endgame, let's say. And here Nakamura took on g4 with the pawn. If he took with the bishop, there's no pressure on the pawns, and they might move slightly easier than in the game. If h3, bishop e6, rook a d1, I think that white has a free hand here, and black always has a tough decision to make. Does he want to push the pawn on d6 further and make his center crumble, or does he want to keep it there and keep it an easy target for white pieces? I don't know what is the best, but it's not pleasant whatsoever. So Nakamura chose this one, rook a d1, but still the d6 pawn remains a problem. But at least in this situation, the knight cannot get to f3. In the previous one, the bishop was on g4, white pushed it away with h3, and then knight f3 was possible, so that makes d5 impossible to play. But in this case, Nakamura felt like he has to do something. He has to play dynamically, he has to play actively, and he plays d5, but a d5 move leaves the e5 pawn quite weak. Fabi took cd, and now rook d1. Now he's trying to force these hanging pawns to move. e4, and now exchange happens, and now c4. Now the point of this is that if you take on c4, queen takes e4, and in the end, knight captures on c4. So actually we'll have a position with the weak pawn on e4, which is gonna be attacked 3 times, and it's gonna be very tough to organize defense on him. Nakamura plays rook e8, and now we have the exchange, knight f1. The knight heads not to g3, but to e3. And now queen e5 by black. I don't know if this was so useful. I think maybe bishop c6 was better, just to keep this structure quite solid. And if rook d1, to just go queen e5, or in that case. And to always interpose stuff like knight e3 with g3. Something like that. Although even in this case, black's king is a bit exposed, and it's not easy to feel safe here. Let's say after this, queen c4, king h8, queen e2 back. Black always has to be on alert. He's on a very thin ice, and a small mistake can make it very, very unpleasant. So it's not an easy task to hold this. He plays this, queen h6, queen g7 back. Of course, the endgame is pleasant for white, but I don't think that there is much to it. Knight e3, bishop e6, and still the bishop versus knight. White is slightly better because he doesn't have any weaknesses, but I don't see how white breaks through, because if you try something like this, black has enough counterplay with rook d8, rook d2. So optically speaking, it looks very good for white, but when you think about it, when you think about all the possibilities for counterplay, it's not all that great. And also, why would you exchange queens when the king is so naked? You would not do that. So Fabi just chose to keep the queens on the board by queen d6, and now bishop c6 back. And finally, knight e3 comes into play, and now g4 becomes a little bit soft. So Nakamura just chose to give up this pawn to shatter the pawn structure of white. And now Fabi takes on g3. Again, if you exchange queens by queen g3 and takes, this is still very pleasant for white, but who knows, if you get your king active enough, it would be tough to push these pawns. Because after all, it's only, technically, it's two pawns, but come on, it's a double pawn. So you need some extra effort to push these pawns. So still, Fabi doesn't want to exchange queens, and he goes hg. But actually here it was the time to go rook f1, just to employ the rook and have some threats like knight f5, knight h6, with some very dangerous attack. And the point is here, if he takes on h2, just king h1. Just make a shelter for the king and avoid any checks, which would bother white's king. And now to stop knight f5, I guess that black has to do something like rook f8, or just to slow down. But still you have this. And if rook f6, well, you can just go queen e5, and in case of this, rook f4, and you have a crushing attack. Rook g4 comes next, and the king cannot survive, I believe. But I think that at this point they were in time trouble, and Fabi felt like he has a sure advantage, so he didn't want to maybe over risk it. So he took on g3, just took a pawn, and maybe his reasoning was like, I always have time for rook f1 and knight f5. Nakamura played a very nice move, queen e5, trying to exchange queens once again. And we had this repetition. And now Fabi went for queen h6. And now he took on g3, rook f1. Now the knight is defended on e3, so there's no worry about that. And because the rook wanted to come into play with rook f5, black had to do something about this, and the best defensive move in this position is just to offer a trade of queens to get some tempi on the queen. Queen h4, and now again black is being very annoying and he's offering a trade. I don't think that there is something better, because if you go bishop d7, knight d5 won't work because of queen d4, but knight f5 might work. And I think that black has to capture. Rook takes, and now rook g5 is a strong threat. So rook e5 looks like the only move. And after a check, king h7, rook f4 with this. Black would play this probably, and white takes a pawn on e4. And now I think the only hope to survive this is to give some checks, because now after queen a1, king f2, you can give a check on f5, because if you do some of these checks, I think you just go up to g3 and to g4. Please check this, but I think this is the case. So after rook f5 here, the king just goes to g3, and in case of this, just to h3. And you exchange rooks eventually, and this endgame is a very tough one to defend for black. If it was only for the g-pawn, not 2 against 2 on the queen side, that would be fairly easy, but in this case, with queens on the board, with the pawns on the queen side on the board, it's a different task, because you always threaten to exchange queens at some point and just to use the g-pawn as a deflection. So it's a very tough position for black at the moment, and he chose to play this, queen g3, and now queen g7. Now Fabi goes back, and Nakamura doesn't repeat. He goes bishop d7, trying to stop knight f5, but actually it's not stopping anything. He could have played knight f5 here and reach a similar position to the previous one I have shown you. But Fabi plays rook d1, and now I think the last chance for black to not hold, but to just prolong the game was to go rook e7. And in case of this, to go rook f7. So let's say if you take the pawn, queen goes to g5, and after bishop c6, it's gonna be a bit uncomfortable for white. I think that black has enough play here. And if the knight goes back, well, then bishop c6 just makes things even worse for white. The knight on c6 is making the knight on the bishop on c6 is making knight on e3 way too passive because it has to defend g2. And I feel like this is enough counterplay for a pawn. But anyways, in the game, bishop e6 was played. And now Fabi plays knight d5. And the bad thing about this position is that the bishop is on the wrong diagonal. It belongs to this diagonal now, when it's facing the knight on d5. And by doing this, black is completely passive, he has no counterplay whatsoever, and that's what's making this position completely lost now. Rook f8, and now white takes on e4. But in this case, like I said before, there is no active bishop. And in the previous line we had the bishop on c6, knight on e3, but here it's just bishop on what have I told? A bishop on e6 and knight on d5 is in this position. And after queen h6, rook e1 was played. Of course, the trade of minor pieces just improves white's position because it just cleans the defenders and makes it easier for the heavy pieces to continue the attack. So white tries to force something like queen e6, takes, and rook d5, which would dramatically increase his chances to make a draw. But Fabi just isn't interested in that. He goes knight e7, and now to defend the bishop, king f7, and now knight f5. Because now there is no bishop f5 since queen e7 wins the rook. So after this, knight f5, queen f6 was played. But now, having the king and queen on the same file, Fabi plays rook f1, and this is deadly. This is now game over, because now Nakamura tried bishop d5, but Fabi plays knight h6, the winning move. And in case of king g7, which was played, queen g4, and Nakamura resigned in this position, because if he goes queen g6, which has to be played since the rook attacks, now Fabiano has knight f5. And after king f7, knight h4 wins the queen. Or if king h7, just give a check. And if this, you can take the rook, you can do this, whatever you want. And it's dead lost. So that's it. Thank you so much for watching, and stay tuned for more videos. Bye.